and welcome. All right, I'm just getting my webcam up, so if you want, you can see actually both the slides and the presenter. So hello, everyone. I am Dr. Anna Brutlag. I'm the Director of Veterinary Services here at Pet Poison Helpline, and I am going to be both your host and your presenter this afternoon. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm actually really excited about this webinar. I think there's some really big stuff that as veterinary professionals we need to be aware of. So before I get started, a couple of things I just want to quickly introduce or announce. You can download the presentation slides. If you haven't done so and would like to, please go ahead. You can download them right from your GoToMeeting dashboard, or you can actually download them from our website. If you go to petpoisonhelpline.com and go to the For Vets tab, you'll find a link to our webinars. So feel free, go ahead, grab the slides if you like. They will be available after today as well. They'll be stored on our website. So if you don't need them today, don't worry about it. I also wanted to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded. So if you have to leave early, or you have a colleague that you think would really benefit from listening to this, or you want to listen to it again, you are more than welcome to. We will be posting the recording within the next day or so on our website, as we do with all of our webinars. So that's another plug. If you need free CE, all of our toxicology webinars are RACE approved for an hour of CE. They're all conveniently loaded on our website. You can access them at any point in time. So as far as CE certificates go, speaking of CE, we will be emailing out the CE certificates to everyone who is registered and attending by next Monday, August 27th. So if you do not get your CE certificate by the end of Monday, please contact us. And our email address is on the one of the last slides here, but it's info@petpoisonhelpline.com. So again, wait till Monday before you contact us, but we'll get it out. Now, here's another really important tidbit. If you are watching this in a group and you are not the one registered and signed in, you can still get interactive CE approval. All we need you to do is just let us know. You have 24 hours to do that, but let us know within the next 24 hours that you watched our webinar. And so send us an email, again, to info@petpoisonhelpline.com, and give us your name and your email address, or those who, of course, watched with you, and we will issue CE certificates. But you have a very strict deadline. You have 24 hours to let us know. Otherwise, we can't issue you an interactive CE certificate. So, real quick, I did want to let you know that you're welcome to ask questions as we go through the webinar. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Amanda Poldowski, is going to be answering questions as we go along, so you can just write them into the question box. And if there's something that she can't answer or she wants me to answer, she'll just wait until the end of the presentation, and then I will answer at that point in time. So today's webinar is an hour long. I will try and keep it within that time frame. I certainly want to be respectful of your time. If we do tend to go a little bit over and you have to leave, not a problem at all. You'll certainly still get credit for being here. And if you want to stick around, we will have some time at the end to answer questions. So that may be the part that goes past the top of the hour. All right, everyone, let's get started. So very quickly, I want to thank, first of all, our sponsor, which is the manufacturers of Decon. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about them in a second, so we'll get into that, why they're sponsoring this particular webinar. But first of all, I just want to say thank you very much, and I think that you will also be very grateful when you hear a little bit more about their story and why they're sponsoring today. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about Pet Poison Helpline. In case you don't know who we are or you haven't attended a webinar before, I just wanted to introduce us. We are a 24/7 human and animal poison control center. Obviously, the Pet Poison Helpline side is the animal side. And we are based out of the Minneapolis area, the Twin Cities area in Minnesota. As you can see on the screen there, we have a pretty large staff. So we have over 20 vets, over 75 techs. And we'll talk a little bit about the human side of what we do as well, which is where we have some PharmDs, some MDs, and other human medical support professionals. So for Pet Poison Helpline, we do have a consultation fee per case. That's $59. That's a one-time fee. So no matter how many times you need to call back about your vitamin D case, or a pet owner needs to call, that's all covered under that one-time fee. And then with every case, we will give you certainly a copy of the case notes as well, and we can send that via fax or email. Now, one thing at Pet Poison Helpline that we're really proud of and we really push and pride ourselves on is that we are an educational center. And I hear time and time again, especially when I'm at vet conferences, people say, I just didn't get enough veterinary toxicology in school, or, it's hard for me to grasp at that point in time, and they just don't feel like I know enough. Well, that's why we're here. I mean, obviously, we're here as a partner for clinics. We're here to help you when you have cases that you need assistance with, but we also want to teach you. And so if you feel like there's any deficits in your toxicology knowledge, like I said, we have a litany of webinars that you can view on our website. And we also have some free tools that you can see listed here on this page. We have a textbook that we put out, second edition, iPhone app, a bunch of free resources for clinics, which are partly geared towards pet owners. So videos, for example, that you can upload onto your clinic site, you can share them on social media, etc. So we try and send out or make available a lot of information for you to help educate your clientele as well. So now I'd like to talk about something that we don't, if you've attended our webinars before, we don't tend to talk about all that much, and that's the human side of what we do. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because this is one of the ways in which Decon ties in here. So the human side, I guess, or I should say maybe the industry side, is our parent company is Safety Call International. And so Safety Call is the part of our company that contracts out our poison control services. So we're not just Pet Poison Helpline, we actually take that same knowledge and that same staff of poison control experts, and we are available for companies to contract with us, and we will provide poison control services to their consumers, their trainers, etc. So that's where the human side comes in. So for example, if you were to pick up a container of Decon and you call the medical number on the back of that container, that call may very well end up here. And it doesn't matter if it's a child that ingested the product, dog, cat, ostrich, what have you, that call, again, like I said, may very well end up here, and our medical experts will be assisting the person who's calling. So as Safety Call, we are academically affiliated. We have formal affiliation with the College of Pharmacy. We have more of an informal affiliation with the College of Vet Med by way of people here, including myself, are also faculty at the College of Veterinary Medicine. Now, one of the courses we teach, of course, is the veterinary toxicology course. So I put up the list, as you can see here, of the industries served. So these are different industries that we work with as Safety Call and provide medical support for. So you can see it's pretty broad, and that makes sense because really, in the end, it's all about toxicology, product safety. So the makers of Decon, they're one of the clients, obviously, that I just mentioned that we work with. And they asked us, and I'm going to get into this in a little bit more detail later, but that's one of the reasons they knew about us and asked us if we could help educate veterinarians about this major change that they're undertaking with their rodenticides. So we'll get into the backstory in just a bit. All right, let's move on. So on with the show here. I just wanted to introduce myself quickly. If you would like, you can have a webcam, or you can see me as the presenter. If that's distracting, minimize it. It's not a big deal. You're not going to miss anything. And if you can't see me, there I am. I'm, again, Anna Brutlog. I'm a board-certified veterinary toxicologist, and I've been here with Pet Poison Helpline for almost 15 years at this point in time. As I mentioned, I also teach at the veterinary school, the College of Veterinary Medicine, the University of Minnesota as well. So my background is I'm small animal, primarily. I graduated from the University of Minnesota. I was in small animal practice in the Minneapolis metro area for a couple of years, but I actually started working in poison control as a wee vet student many, many years ago, and I really loved it. I wanted to go out, get my, kind of clinical chops and make sure I had a pretty good firm foundation as far as the clinical side of things goes. And I thought if I still, like the poison control side after being here part-time and kind of dabbling in it, I will think about coming back full-time. So that's what I did. I spent my training for my postdoc work, split it between Pet Poison Helpline, University of California, Davis, doing a professional externship there, and the University of Minnesota doing a master's program. So let's talk about why we're here. Here's what we're going to go over today. So I want to help you understand why there's been a big change in rodenticides in the U.S. So we're going to tell the tale of what has happened over the past 15 years in the U.S. that's made for a major shift in rodenticide regulations. And we'll very quickly talk a little bit about anticoagulants and bromethylin because those are still out there, and I want you to understand briefly what they do and how they contrast with cholecalciferol. And then we'll get in depth on cholecalciferol. So here's a history lesson. Let me tell you a little story about what's happened, and this is actually something that I've been involved with, even so far as going and being able to present to EPA. So before 2008, and really, in fact, before kind of 2011, when everything really was mandated to change, the most common active ingredient, rodenticide active ingredient, that you would have had in your home, if you were buying it then or you're seeing patients at that point, was what was called a second-generation anticoagulant. And sometimes in the veterinary world, we call those long-acting anticoagulants. They're also called super warfarins because they're the second generation of anticoagulants that are out there, with warfarin being kind of the prototype for the first gen. And we'll talk about the difference between first gens and second generations in a second. But that was before 2008. Then EPA in 2008 came out with they called a risk mitigation decision, which said, all right, everyone, by the middle of 2011, the major changes have to take place. And we'll talk about those. One of those major changes was they really broke the rodenticide world into two pieces. One being consumer use products. So this is what you can buy if you want to put rodenticides in your home, your garage, your attic, that kind of thing. The other arm is the ag and professional use products. So there's a strict division between these two. And as veterinarians, most of the cases that we see, of course, are animals getting into the consumer use products or products that are used in the home. And one of the other biggest changes that happened was EPA said it is no longer acceptable to sell second-generation anticoagulant baits for use in the home. So no more second gens in the house. And I have a little asterisk there. That asterisk means unless it were to be placed by a pest control operator. Otherwise, the general public is not going to be able to go out and buy second-generation anticoagulants for use in the home. So let's talk really quickly about what the difference between a first-generation and a second-generation anticoagulant is. As you can see here, as I mentioned, warfarin, we all know what that is. Warfarin is the prototype for the first-generation anticoagulant. It's been around a long time, as you can see here. Back in the 40s is when it was developed, and I don't know if this is kind of a fun tidbit, but warfarin got its name because it was actually developed in Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation was a big funder of that project. So warfarin, you can see where that came from. So anyways, I thought that was kind of fun. But I wanted to let you know, so the first generation, these are kind of your old school anticoagulants, if you will. A couple of other common ones are chlorfacinone, difacinone, so ones that you might have heard of. Now, typically, these are shorter-acting products when we're looking at, comparing the first and the second generation anticoagulant rodenticide. So here we have our second generation. Now, this is pretty much what you've been used to treating. If you've treated a pet exposed to an anticoagulant rodenticide, for the most part, at least probably up until a couple of years ago, you were probably treating animals exposed to second-generation anticoagulants. And those second generation, they were developed primarily because rodents were becoming resistant to the first generation anticoagulants. So the first gens just didn't work as well anymore. And so hence the second generation came around. And the second generation, brodifacoum, I want to point out specifically because that's what decon was for many, many, many years. So if you had a decon case in, last decade, it was probably a brodifacoum type product, or probably was actually brodifacoum as the anticoagulant. Other anticoagulants, bromadiolone, that used to be in the Tomcat products that were sold for in-home use. So again, you may have seen plenty of those. Now, as a whole, they're typically more toxic than the first generations, and part of the reason is because they are longer acting. and they can bioaccumulate. And this is a problem, especially for wildlife and for raptors in particular. So that was one of the things that EPA was worried about when they changed this regulation, or changed the rodenticide regulations, is part of that decision was to help protect raptors and wildlife as a whole. Okay, so I hope that gives you a good breakdown of the first generations versus the second gen. So first gen and second gen is kind of how I tend to call them. That's what I'll refer to them as. So knowing the difference, let me just quickly walk you through what were the major changes in, and I say here 2011, because by 2011, that was the point at which EPA gave manufacturers, or that's when they said you have to change. We're putting all these changes in place. You have until the middle of 2011 to make your changes. So remember, I said they came up with two arms. There's the consumer arm, consumer products, and the ag products. So this is what the new regulations say. If you're selling a consumer product, the maximum amount that you could fit in a consumer bag of rodenticide products, so I have one right here, would be 1 pound. So again, max size of 1 pound, and these are things that you would buy to put in your house. Now, on the ag side, what they decided to do is to prevent the average consumer from going and buying pounds and pounds of rodenticide, especially second generation, is they said, okay, on the ag side, you have to have at least a 4 pound minimum. And the other thing that they did on the consumer side, again, so here's our consumer product, is they said every consumer product package needs to be sold with a bait station. So it's a protective bait station to prohibit kids and pets, etc., from getting into the rodenticide. So that's not true on the agricultural side. The other thing that's very interesting is they restricted where these products can be sold. So if you want to sell you can sell your consumer use product rodenticides basically anywhere. But the big kicker is if you wanted to sell a 4 pound bucket of rodenticide to put around your farm site, that is very restricted. You can only sell large volumes of these rodenticides in farm stores or tractor supply stores. You cannot sell these ag type products in a Target, a Home Depot, a hardware store, etc. Here's the other, kind of the third big change is, and this we just talked about, they limited the active ingredients that can be used in a consumer setting. So as you can see on your screen, what EPA said is, remember, you can no longer use second generation anticoagulants. That was a massive change because that's what the vast majority of consumer rodenticides were on the market at the time. Instead, they said, all right, you can use first generation anticoagulants, like your warfarins that we just talked about. You can use bromethalin, which is a neurotoxicant. You can use cholecalciferol or vitamin D3. Zinc phosphide is used too, but we're not going to talk about that because it has kind of some special uses, but that is still allowed for in-home use. So on the ag side, however, it's a totally different story. So on the ag side, you can still sell your second generation anticoagulants, no problem. Interestingly, they made a minimum size for those. So the minimum size that you can buy if you want to buy an second generation anticoagulant is actually 8 pounds. So the 4 pound minimum is for bromethalin, cholecalciferol, everything else. For a second generation, if you want to buy brodifacoum still, you have to actually buy 8 pounds of it. And the reason EPA did that is because, again, they felt that a consumer who just wanted to put rodenticide around their home in the fall is not going to go and purchase an 8 pound container of rodenticide. So the final big change here was they also restricted the formulations that can be used. So, for consumer bait, they now said the only allowable formulation is a block bait, or what we're going to talk about today, which are these soft baits, and you'll see them a little bit. We'll talk about them a little bit more. The big change is no more pellets. So you probably are very familiar with the blue pellets that we all used to use as rodenticide, or we'd see pets get into. Well, those can no longer be sold for consumer use. You can still use pellets in the ag side. So you can still get your 8-pound bucket of pellets for agricultural use, but it would not be legal for you to purchase those 8 pounds of pellets and use them in your home. The reason they didn't want pellets being used is because there were lots of reports of children, or children could easily pick up a couple of pellets and eat it. Now, yes, that happened. The American Association of Poison Control Centers would say, vehemently that while that happened, it was not causing poisoning in children, but yes, there were exposures. So now, a kid could still theoretically pick up a block and gnaw on that. So very interesting decisions, lots of controversy, obviously, as you can see here, and we won't get too much into the controversy, but this is the state of affairs. And now, here comes DECON. So, as I mentioned, DECON had used second-generation anticoagulants up until this point in their consumer rodenticides. They are one of the largest, if not the largest, manufacturer of rodenticides. So traditionally, they use verdificum and diphthiolone. They initially tried switching, because obviously they had to switch to something. They initially tried switching to a first-generation anticoagulant, but because of genetic resistance in rodents, they weren't very convinced that would work very well. So they kind of immediately began figuring out what they were going to use next. And they felt like the decision was between cholecalciferol and bromethalin. And so ultimately, as you now know, they ended up going with cholecalciferol. They did not choose bromethalin because they felt that being a neurotoxicant, not having an effective antidote, it was a more dangerous choice when looking at pediatric or human exposures and pet exposures. So kind of put between a rock and a hard place, they went with cholecalciferol. And I, at this point in time, really want to give them some kudos because they had the foresight to know that this was going to have a major impact on pets, consumers, and veterinarians when animals are exposed to DECON. Because we're all used to treating DECON like an anticoagulant, because that's what it's always been. It doesn't matter if it was first generation or second generation, it's always been an anticoagulant. Now, the playing field has totally shifted. When an animal is getting into a DECON product, it may very well be cholecalciferol. Eventually, they will all be transitioned to cholecalciferol. And obviously, as veterinarians, this is something we need to be aware of because we are going to have to treat those cases extremely differently than we would have when we were treating anticoagulant cases. So again, I want to give them kudos to making a very large push to educate the veterinary community about this case, or about this change. That's why they came to us. They said, can you please help us reach out to vets? And we said, of course, this is what we do, and this is a very important message that we would like to get across to veterinarians. So that's why we're here today. So I want to just illustrate that story a little bit more by just showing you some pet poison helpline data of the the rodenticide cases that we've had over the years. So as you can see here, this is going back to 2009, this blue shaded box. This is that time frame over which manufacturers they were instructed to switch their processes around. Everyone had to be compliant with the new regulations by the middle of 2011. So that's right here. And the lines that you're seeing here, I split this into the types of rodenticides that we're called about most frequently. So the blue line is the percentage of second-generation anticoagulants that were called about at Pet Poison Helpline. This is not our industry cases at all. This has nothing to do with that. This is just strictly when you call Pet Poison Helpline. This is the data that I'm presenting. The green line is the number of our bromethalin cases. Red are first-generation anticoagulants, and purple at the very bottom here is cholecalciferol. So you can see when these regulations first went into effect, as I mentioned, almost all the rodenticide calls that we got were second generation. Now, by the time we hit about 2016, this was a major shift for us on the Pet Poison Helpline side because that was the first point at which bromethalin rodenticide calls or cases outnumbered anticoagulant rodenticides. So if you want to learn more about bromethalin, we're going to talk about it really quickly today, but there is a full-fledged webinar on anticoagulants and bromethalin that we recorded several years ago. Everything is still current, and we recorded it actually specifically because of this rodenticide change for EPA. And at that point, our prediction was, hey, look out, everyone. You're going to start to be seeing a lot more bromethylin cases. And sure enough. Now, here we are today, and obviously cholecalciferol is on the market. So you can see we have not had a lot of cholecalciferol cases, rodenticide cases over the years. It's out there, but not in large quantities. And this graph is a little bit misleading here, but this should, from the beginning, January 1st of 2018 to now, we've actually seen quite a spike in cholecalciferol rodenticide cases. Unsurprising, since DCAN has switched over to that. So let's do a very quick review of anticoagulants and bromethylin. We talked about what the differences between the first generations and the second generations. Just a quick reminder, anticoagulant rodenticides, they are called that because they inhibit the body's ability to clot its blood. They inhibit vitamin K-dependent clotting factors. And the signs that we see, of course, are a little bit delayed with anticoagulants. It takes the body a while to burn through all its current clotting factors before you're going to start to see bleeding. The test we prefer to use is, of course, PT, because that's the most sensitive test. It's going to pick up on, it's the most sensitive because it's going to be the most positive or prolonged before any of your other coagulation tests will be, excuse me. Pardon me. So, and as we all know, anticoagulants, kind of loved them as a rodenticide. If you had to get into something, at least this is treatable. Very easily treatable, I guess I should say. Vitamin K1 was the antidote, oral, pretty easy to give and give. So again, for a really thorough review of rodenticides, please, I would encourage you to watch the webinar that we created a couple of years ago. We will actually, in tomorrow's in the email that we send you with your CE certificate, we'll include a link to that webinar so you can learn more about them if you want to. This is just a quick reference for you, the signs that we tend to see with anticoagulant rodenticide. And again, I always want to reiterate, it's not bleeding. Bleeding is not the most common sign that's seen with anticoagulant rodenticides. In fact, as you can see here, dyspnea, lethargy, coughing, pallor, those are the common signs we see with anticoagulants. And why is that? Well, it's this guy right here. So for those of you who are maybe as familiar with looking at radiographs, this is, all the veterinary professionals here, of course, know, but this is an animal with a lot of something, fluid, of course, in its chest cavity. So what this actually was blood. What we usually see in anticoagulant rodenticide cases is internal bleeding. That's one of the first places they bleed. They're intracavital bleeds versus mucosal bleeds. And this is because that's typical of factor deficiencies. You tend to see cavital bleeds versus low platelets. You would tend to see more mucosal bleeds. So no wonder this guy is dyspneic, can't breathe, he's lethargic, he's pale, because he's got a chest full of blood. So again, that's a brief review of anticoagulants. Bromethylin. Now, bromethylin, here's a couple of the examples of what's out there as far as bromethylin. These are some of, again, the newer bromethylin products that come, like I said, they come in the bait station. They're in block form. The problem, of course, with all of these packaged rodenticides is, yes, the bait station is great and can be very helpful. But as you can see here, this is kind of a flimsy-ish, a thinner plastic bag with a whole bunch of blocks, up to a pound of blocks of rodenticide. So the problem, and we need to be aware of this or warn pet owners about it, is, again, just because it comes to the bait station doesn't mean there's not a whole handful, it's always hard to get the camera, of blocks of bait in that bag. So we've had plenty of cases where the dog just chews right through the bag, the cardboard box, etc., of rodenticide and accesses it that way. So just keep that in mind. But so bromethylin, as a quick reminder, cats are actually quite a bit more sensitive to bromethylin than dogs are. So here are some toxic doses just for your reference. And as I said, bromethylin is a neurotoxicant. So here's what we can see. This is a slide from gray matter, from a brain, cortical white matter, in a dog in an experimental trial with bromethylin poisoning. And you can see these big holes here. Well, we oughtn't have big holes in our brain. That's never a good sign. So that is one of the direct consequences of bromethalin and one of the reasons that we see neurological signs. So ultimately with bromethalin, we can see things like seizures, tremors, paralysis, death. In cats, we tend to mostly see paralytic symptoms. In dogs, we can see more paralytic symptoms typically if it's an ingestion under the LD50. If it's an ingestion over the LD50, we tend to see more convulsant syndrome or the convulsant syndrome or convulsions, seizures, tremors. So, not all animals read the book, but that's kind of just a general rough overview of bromethalin. And treatment can be long and complicated. We try and decontaminate those animals as fast as possible because that's really the prevention. Well, obviously, if they didn't eat it all, that'd be best. But if they do, try and get it out and prevent absorption. And if they do get sick, it's very symptomatic supportive care. So again, we really go into detail in the other rodenticide webinar. So I'd encourage you to watch that for more information. All right, let's go back to the reason that we're here and talk about cholecalciferol. So I have a little poll for you here. Bear with me just a second. All right, so cholecalciferol, you've heard of this before, my guess is, even if you don't know the chemical name, as you've heard it called vitamin D. Technically, it's vitamin D3. That's important. Cholecalciferol is part of the vitamin D that we receive from dietary sources, especially from meat-based sources. And it's also called the sunshine vitamin because, especially if you live in a northern climate, you're harped on this a lot, but humans are able to make cholecalciferol from UV light. And I mentioned northern climates because many of our physicians will tell us in the wintertime we're not getting enough sun exposure, so we have to supplement vitamin D. And so my question for everyone here is, so people synthesize vitamin D from the sun. Now, what about our critters? So here's a poll. I'm going to launch this for you. So the question is, cats and dogs can or cannot synthesize vitamin D from the sun. So I'll let everyone answer here. We'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's see what our results are. And okay, so you guys, overwhelmingly, absolutely correct. Cats and dogs cannot synthesize vitamin D very well, or cannot synthesize vitamin D from UV light, so they rely on dietary sources. So that's one major difference between cats and dogs and us. Let's talk a little bit more about cholecalciferol. So I just wanted to kind of mention a few other poisoning sources for vitamin D, because even though we're talking about rodenticides today, it's good to know there's other sources out there. At Pet Poison Helpline, the number one source that we see as far as exposures is actually human vitamin D supplements. So it's a little fish oil, or it's capsules that you can buy at any sort of Target, Walmart type store. So vitamin D supplements, we see a lot of those, presumably because a lot of people have them at home. Another one to just keep on your radar are vitamin D analogs, and those are found in psoriasis creams. And this is a particularly nasty type of vitamin D. So it's a vitamin D analog. It's a very active form of vitamin D, and the toxic dose is extremely small. So if you have a dog or a cat that gets a hold of a tube of the psoriasis cream, or it licks it off its pet owner, it licks it off its owner, potentially, really we kind of consider all of those cases to be likely emergencies. So if you ever do hear about a case like that, you're talking to a pet owner, make sure they get that dog in immediately, or certainly if you need help, you contact a poison center immediately. And again, that's specifically with psoriasis creams. Very, very nasty. Doesn't seem like it would be, and the other problem with them is they seem to be, to dogs at least, very tasty. So if a dog gets a hold of a tube of psoriasis cream, it eats the whole thing. So again, major problem from a toxicology standpoint. And then certainly there are a lot of plants that contain vitamin D, but if you're a small animal, cat or dog, you are really going to have to eat a lot of plant matter before I would worry about vitamin D poisoning. So that's really something we see with grazing animals. And just a quick mention of vitamin D, it's actually really, it may surprise you, but it's considered a hormone. And the reason it's considered a hormone is because of the effects that it has on the body. So as we know, as medical professionals, vitamin D is really important for calcium homeostasis. But it impacts many different organ systems, your musculoskeletal system, your immune system, your cardiovascular system, your CNS, PNS system. In the human world, low vitamin D deficiency is something that's talked about a lot. There's thought that people who are vitamin D deficient might be at risk for hypertension, diabetes, certain cancers, infectious disease, asthma, etc. I mean, it's really, when you start to read the literature, you kind of start to feel like there's nothing that vitamin D doesn't impact, which makes it a little complex. In fact, right now, I think the current estimate is that there are more than 2,000 genes that are either directly or indirectly regulated by vitamin D. So pretty impressive little molecule. All right. I wanted to just real quickly show you an example of how many vitamin D cases we get here at Pet Poison Helpline. So what this graph is comparing it, let's say we compared it to rodenticides, right? We know the orange line down here, that's our little cholecalciferol line that you saw before. I combined all the anticoagulant rodenticides here, but the red, what this is the number of the corresponding number of vitamin D3 supplement cases that we get at Pet Poison Helpline. So rodenticides are always within our top 5. It's when we look at what the most common toxins that we're called about are. Rodenticides are always up there in the top 5. Well, in the past couple of years, actually, vitamin D has snuck up into our top list of toxicants as well. And again, mostly that's because more people have vitamin D supplements in their home, which just means more animals are going to get into them. So let's specifically take a look at these the cholecalciferol soft baits that's made by Decon. So here on the screen, you can see there's some specifics about these baits, and here's some pictures of the bait. This is, and again, it's a soft bait. So if you can see, you can kind of, I don't know if it's easy to see or not, but it's kind of a malleable little bait. It sort of has the consistency maybe of a soft starburst or kind of a thick Play-Doh. It's clearly, if you were to handle one, very different from a normal hard block of rodenticide. And each of these little baits, you can see there, weighs about 13 grams. So you can see how much vitamin D is actually in each of these baits. And they're surrounded, as you can see, they're wrapped. So all Decon vitamin D soft baits are going to look like this. They're all going to be wrapped. The reason that they're wrapped, they have kind of a thin little plastic wrapper. The plastic, obviously not a tox risk unless a lot were ingested, and it would be a foreign body risk. But the plastic itself, as you can see here, has really tiny little perforations. That's to allow the scent of the bait to escape and attract rodents. The baits are extremely palatable. In fact, it was kind of interesting. I had the opportunity to speak with some of the researchers who developed this bait, and palatability is something that they worry about because vitamin D in and of itself can taste kind of bitter. And the baits have to be oil-based. So again, vitamin D, because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, in order for rodents to absorb the bait. So what they did is they made these baits pretty much with human food here, as you can see. And in order to test palatability, they tested the bait against piglet feed and silage, and the idea there was to say, okay, piglet feed, silage, these are fairly palatable things if you're a country mouse, right? So the country mouse, piglet feed, silage, or you can eat this bait. And found that mice were certainly very willing to eat the bait. For the city mouse, they tested the bait against hamburger, which I thought was kind of interesting. I live in Minneapolis. I can kind of see, in my neighborhood, you probably test the bait against tacos because that's, I think, what most of the rats are eating in our dumpsters. So, but yes, and the bait was certainly palatable compared to hamburger. So anyways, I thought that was just kind of an interesting aside, but these are what these baits look like. And you can see, again, some of the contents that they have in here. And just as a tip, so if, for identification purposes, if a pet owner were to come to you and they have what they say, you know, a soft bait like this, or they tell you it was a soft bait, and they are 100% sure that it was a Decon brand, and that's always tricky because there are plenty of people who call any rodenticide Decon because it's so popular, just like us calling tissues Kleenex or something like that. But if they're absolutely certain it was a Decon brand mouse poison and it's a soft bait, you can be sure that it is it's a cholecalciferol containing bait. So this is just another picture of the soft baits. I cut one so I could kind of show you how they crumble and what that cut surface looks like. You can even see this is just my finger depression on it. It really, again, they're like a very firm Play-Doh. All right. Just to be thorough here, there are some other cholecalciferol containing baits on the market, but they're all on the ag side. Remember, again, that bifurcation between the consumer baits and the ag or professional use baits. Decon is the only company that has cholecalciferol consumer bait. Everything else, as of today, anyways, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but everything else that I'm aware of is on the ag side. And then I just did want to inform everyone that there are some other soft baits out there. So it's not just Decon, but these other soft baits that are out there, I wasn't able to find any that contain cholecalciferol, but I just do want to make you aware that there are other soft baits. But again, remember, if it's Decon brand and it's a soft bait, it's cholecalciferol. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when an animal, a cat or dog specifically, or this really could be any mammal, eats too much cholecalciferol. And this slide right here really summarizes everything. Like I told you, vitamin D is extremely complex and it affects multiple organ systems. But from a toxicology standpoint, this is what we really see. Number one, vitamin D tends to promote calcium retention. So on the tox side of things, most importantly, we see hypercalcemia and hyperphosphatemia. What happens is vitamin D makes the body absorb more calcium and phosphorus from the gut than it normally would. It also, unfortunately, makes the body absorb more calcium from the urine than it normally would. So it prevents the body from peeing out as much calcium as normal. And then as kind of the final kicker, it mobilizes calcium from the bones. So all of this works together the end result of all of these different mechanisms is hypercalcemia and hyperphosphatemia. These are the hallmarks of vitamin D poisoning. What happens because you have high calcium and high phosphorus is you end up getting metastatic tissue mineralization. So you calcify. Your tissues turn to stone. Think of it as I can't remember my biblical parallels very well, but yes, anyways. So these little creatures effectively, like I said, turn to stone because they're laying down mineral in all sorts of tissue. And what we tend to see in acute poisoning is one of the organs that's most sensitive to those initial changes is the kidney. So typically, well, of course, you all know that with hypercalcemia, we can see a variety of signs, including cardiovascular signs, et cetera. On the tox side of things, we could see those too, but we tend to most often see acute kidney damage. And there is pretty considerable enterohepatic recirculation. So we're going to talk, that's important to know because that's going to impact how we decontaminate these patients. So this little slide right here, this is a section of lung from a cat that died, and this is not a rodenticide case. This is actually more of a chronic cholecalciferol intoxication from food. But you can see, this is obviously not normal lung tissue, right? See all that white mineral that's laid down in the lungs. So cats really tend to put a lot of tissue. They have a lot of mineralization in their lungs. In an acute case, still in cats, we still worry about the kidneys, even though they might be mineralizing their lungs simultaneously. So that's the gist of it. That's what we worry about with cholecalciferol. Now, let's talk about how to diagnose it and treat it. So here's just a reference slide for you as far as timelines. You can kind of know when you have a cholecalciferol case what to expect. Initially, these are some of the signs that we're going to see. A lot of animals have some GI signs to start with. They might be PUPD, and you might be saying, wow, PUPD in less than a day? That's clearly not from acute kidney injury, and you'd be right. It's not. Vitamin D in and of itself induces PUPD. So this is what we tend to see early on. Now, as we go over the first few days post-ingestion, that's when you're going to start to notice an increase in calcium and phosphorus. And historically, we've kind of said that phosphorus, or phosphate, I guess if I were being technically correct, but I'll say phosphorus because that's what I'm used to, but your serum phosphorus tends to go up or rise before serum calcium. It's not always true, but it can be something to help look at. So when you're monitoring, and we're going to definitely talk about how to monitor these patients, but when you're monitoring patients, monitoring serum phosphorus and calcium both can be helpful. And if you do see phosphorus start to rise, that should be a trigger for you. That should be a point of concern because probably serum calcium is going to start to rise as well. And you can potentially see abnormalities with potassium too. Part of that can come certainly because of acute renal injury, but you can see some abnormalities also because of vitamin D. But for the most part, what we see are looking for hypercalcemia and hyperphosphatemia. And then after several days have gone by, you have significant metastatic mineralization in the body in all sorts of tissues. Of course, the kidneys, like we talked about, are primarily affected here. This is when acute kidney injury becomes extremely apparent. These are animals that are azotemic. Now they may be PUPD simply because of renal injury, and they're oftentimes have dilute urine to accompany that. So this is actually an example from that same slide of the lung that I just showed you, but this is a cat that died, again, not rodenticide-related D3, but this is a more of a chronic cholecalciferol ingestion. But I just wanted to show you, because I think it's a really good example from a necropsy photos, what you can see. So let's look at the kidneys real quick. Kidneys we talked about being severely impacted. Wow, I mean, look at how that cortex stands out. Unfortunately, you can just imagine cutting through that cortex. It's going to be extremely crunchy to cut through because of all the mineral that's laid down there. This is the stomach, and you can see in the rugal folds, maybe some of you can appreciate all these little bumps, which again are just small tissue deposits, mineral deposits in the stomach. This is the heart and the aorta, and you can see some mineral deposits along the aorta as well. And there again are the lungs before they were cut. So if you've necropsied an animal before, you know that this is not what lungs should look like when you take them out of a body. They should not stand up on their own to that degree. They should not be light pink. These almost look, you can imagine them as like a hyperinflated lung. But again, you can see all this mineral that's laid down, the light color in the lung. And that would be, that would be what I would expect to see in a case of cholecalciferol intoxication. Now, an animal certainly might die before they've mineralized other tissues to this degree, and maybe it'd just really be the kidney that we'd be seeing. But you certainly expect you to see tissue mineralization in a variety of tissues. So what's the toxic dose for cholecalciferol? Well, here's a couple of things. So toxic doses, I want to spend a little bit of time here because this is where things get tricky. There are vitamin D, let me just back up a second. There's significant individual variation in how much vitamin D it takes to cause poisoning in any given animal. So the doses that you see here, this 0.1 mg per kg and 0.5 mg per kg, these are kind of the low end of the published ranges and the low end of what we've seen here at Pet Poison Helpline. So if you have an animal with about 0.1 mg per kg, you may start to see some of those GI signs we talked about, maybe some PUPD again from vitamin D. But I don't expect animals to become hypercalcemic until they're really exceeding 0.5 mg per kg. And because of this extreme individual variation, you can have cats or dogs that eat much more than that and remain asymptomatic, or at least don't exhibit hypercalcemia or don't develop hypercalcemia or hyperphosphatemia. So these toxic doses are kind of a guide. Again, we want to be very conservative, so this is where we start to get worried about cases. But again, there are going to be plenty of cases out there that can tolerate these amounts just fine. So what I wanted to do is, since we're talking about this particular decon bait, just show you how much an animal can eat of these baits before we have to worry about achieving or reaching that hypercalcemic dose. So let's take our typical, 4.5 kg, 10-pound cat. That's only 3 grams of bait before we are potentially looking at hypercalcemia. For a 35-pound dog, we're looking at about 10, 11 grams of bait, so not quite the whole bait. And for a 65-pound dog, they would have to eat more than one of these baits before I'm worried about hypercalcemia. But it gives you a pretty good idea, I think, of how small the toxic dose of vitamin D3 potentially is. Now, if you look in the literature, this is certainly, as I mentioned, there's a large individual sensitivity, and there's a range of published LD50s out there, anywhere from 13 mg per kg up to 88. That 88 mg per kg study has always perplexed me. It was published back in '84 in a proceedings at a pest control conference. I have never actually been able to, because the study, to the best of my knowledge, has not been published. I have not been able to actually look at the details of that study. So I don't know what dogs they used, how the vitamin D was administered, was it in oil, was it not, what kind of signs did they see, et cetera. So clinically, in our experience and looking at the rest of the literature out there, I think that 88 mg per kg LD50 is probably not terribly reliable. So if you wanted to hang your hat on something a little bit more reasonable, 13 mg per kg is probably in that ballpark. In a study that was done feeding D3 to dogs with the idea of inducing hypercalcemia to test various treatments, they fed those dogs 8 mg per kg, and one of those were purpose-bred beagles, if I remember correctly, and one of those dogs actually was so severely affected that it had to be euthanized before the study, within a couple of days, before they really even had a chance to do a lot of treatments. So you can see, it doesn't take a lot necessarily. All right, and just a quick reminder, some animals, like your very young animals, especially those that are nursing, are potentially more at risk for vitamin D poisoning. Vitamin D is fat-soluble, passed in the milk. Neonates and the young take up more vitamin D than adults would typically anyways. So there you have it. Real quick, since we're talking about, how toxic potentially vitamin D could be, I thought it might be interesting to show you the percentage of cases that we as Pet Poison Helpline actually end up sending in when we get a call about it. So the purple line, or the purple bars right here, represent decon cases, actual decon cholecalciferol cases. The green bars represent just cholecalciferol rodenticides in general that we just exclusively got through Pet Poison Helpline. The purple bars came through us from the decon manufacturer themselves. As you can see, we're remarkably consistent, but we tend to send in the vast, vast majority of dogs and cats that are exposed to cholecalciferol baits. Now, if you compare that to just vitamin D3 supplements, oftentimes with capsules that people have at home, there's a pretty stark difference. And the reason we don't send in nearly as many vitamin D supplement cases is really dose. If a dog gets 1 vitamin D supplement pill, again, highly, highly unlikely that that dog ingested a toxic dose. If it got 50, that's a totally different ballgame. But that's why I thought it would be just kind of interesting to show you from a referral standpoint, sort of what our data looks like. All right, so I want to be mindful of time. We don't have that much time left, and I want to make sure we talk about diagnosis and treatment. So let's move ahead. We're going to kind of very quickly talk about absorption. As I mentioned before, vitamin D, fat-soluble, needs fat in the gut to really be absorbed. Done. Half-life of vitamin D. This is a problem for us as on the tox side of things. The half-life of vitamin D in total is very long. Really, the whole body half-life of vitamin D is about 2 months. So what that means is when you have a dog or a cat that got into a toxic dose of cholecalciferol, unfortunately, it's hanging around for a while. And it oftentimes means that these dogs take a long time to treat, or cats. All right, so now let's talk about diagnostic testing. I have another poll for everyone. So when that dog or cat first comes into the clinic after being exposed to a potentially toxic dose of vitamin D, one of the first things we want to do is check either a calcium, total serum calcium, or an ionized calcium. And I want you to tell me which one should we pick. So, all right, here's the poll. Question being, is it better in cases of vitamin D poisoning to measure total serum calcium or ionized calcium? Okay, so we're going to close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Share the poll so you guys can see it. So there are the results. And you guys are very smart, of course. Yes, it's true. The best thing to check is ionized calcium. And so let me hide that there. All right. Now, if you're scrambling to write down the answers because maybe you didn't get it right, don't worry. I have a slide at the end of the presentation that has all the poll answers. So don't worry, even if you got it wrong, it'll be there. So ionized calcium. This is a point I want to make, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, because ionized calcium, the difference between ionized calcium and total serum calcium is the ionized calcium is just the fraction of the body's calcium that is active. It's free, essentially free as in unbound. It's not bound to protein. It's not bound to bicarb or phosphate or anything like that. So there's 3 phases of calcium. There's your ionized, your total serum, your protein-bound calcium, and then what they call typically your chelated calcium, which is bound to, like I said, bicarb and other things. Ideally, you always want to measure your ionized calcium in these cases because it's going to tell you what the active form of calcium is doing. That's going to give you better information on your patient because you're going to know really how hypercalcemic they are versus looking at your total calcium, which is helpful but doesn't exactly give us the fine tools that we really want when we're trying to figure out how to manage these patients. So here's another question for you. Can you use, let's say, you're like, well, I'm really used to total serum calcium, and ionized calcium is kind of a pain, and I don't really want to do it. Can you use your total serum calcium? Is that good enough to be able to predict what your ionized calcium is? So I'm going to close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Let me share these results with you. So we're a little closer on this one, and that's understandable. What the answer is here is actually no. You cannot use total serum calcium to reliably predict ionized calcium. And there are some really good papers that have come out about this over the past couple of years. I would really encourage you, and they're listed in the references section at the end of these slides, so you have that. I wanted to make sure people had a good idea as to, how to understand and interpret ionized versus total serum calcium. But unfortunately, it hasn't been found to be a very good predictor. So this is why when we're thinking about vitamin D poisoning, we really, really encourage clinicians to measure ionized calcium. And if you're not familiar with collecting it, you haven't really done that before, this website at the bottom of the screen, it's from Cornell's ClinPath page. They have a fantastic description of how to properly collect blood for ionized calcium, how to store it, etc. So again, the lab that you send your blood to, if you don't actually measure ionized calcium in your own clinic, then I would certainly give the lab a call and they'll help you. But this is a great short little read about how to collect it. All right, so just as we talked about before, vitamin D causes hypercalcemia, hyperphosphatemia. Here's what you want to be watching for when you're monitoring these patients. So at this point in time, I realize, and I feared this might happen, it's about the top of the hour. I'm going to keep going because I want to talk a little bit more about diagnostic testing and treatment, of course. I'm so sorry that this went longer than I anticipated. Please stick around. If you can't stick around, this webinar will be recorded. You will be able to just go ahead and watch the bit at the end that you missed about treatment. So we're going to continue on. All right, diagnostic testing. In addition to calcium and phosphorus, here are the other things you really want to pay attention to. So obviously we're worried about renal injury. Monitor BUN and creatinine. Ideally, in a patient that ingested a toxic dose that you have hospitalized, I would monitor calcium and phosphorus, ionized calcium ideally, phosphorus, BUN and creatinine every 24 hours. And let's see what happens. Monitor them every 24 hours for at least a good 2 to 3 days. If nothing has happened by that point, I don't really expect it to. So if we don't see any degree of hyperphosphatemia, hypercalcemia by 48 to 72 hours, we should be out of the woods. But these are things you want to keep an eye on. Definitely, obviously, keep an eye on, get a baseline UA and a baseline urine-specific gravity, so we know where we're starting, because again, we're worried about the kidneys. We want to know what our baseline is and see where we're starting out. And then I really can't talk enough about how helpful your simple little PCV and total protein or total solids are going to be in these cases. These are cases, and we're going to talk about this in a second, obviously, that we're going to be putting on potentially pretty heavy doses of fluids. Since we're worried about the kidneys, we want to use our PCV total solids to help us understand how hydrated these patients are and help us understand, and then by that we can figure out how to adjust our fluids. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit more depth in a second. Now, people often ask, well, is there any confirmatory testing for vitamin D? So, for example, when I go to the physician and I get blood drawn annually, they always look for vitamin D. Now, I am in Minnesota, and that could be why, but obviously for reasons that we talked about earlier, vitamin D deficiency is a significant concern in human medicine right now. So when you go to your doctor and they're drawing vitamin D levels, they're probably drawing this right here, this 25-hydroxycholecalciferol, or calcidiol is probably a much easier term to say. So confirmatory tests do exist. The problem is, first of all, they're not very common in vet med. Second of all, they are not necessarily all that helpful in cases of vitamin D poisoning. So there is a quote I gave you here that, looking back at kind of a retrospective, a bunch of animal cases, or a bunch of animal studies, it is thought that this particular vitamin D metabolite does increase, 15, 20 times, significantly, does increase quite a bit within poisoning. However, the problem is this particular vitamin D metabolite doesn't necessarily correlate very well with the onset of hypercalcemia. So, for example, let me just throw out a few numbers for you. There was a study that looked at almost 300 German Shepherds and Golden Retrievers. And these were healthy dogs, supposedly. They measured this particular vitamin D metabolite right here, calcidiol, on these dogs. And what they found was they had a quote-unquote normal range that was a mile wide. The normal range itself was somewhere between 22 and about 620. And that was nanomoles per liter. So normally you can see this massive range. So that makes interpretation of these tests difficult. Also, in cases involving poisoning, you might very well see, if a dog ingests vitamin D, you might certainly see an elevated calcidiol level, but that does not necessarily mean that animal is going to become hypercalcemic. And if they're not hypercalcemic, we don't really care. So it's a lot easier to measure calcium and phosphorus in the clinic than it is to send out vitamin D tests. So that's one of the other reasons that we don't do it, because again, it doesn't help. It's not that helpful from a predictive standpoint. So now just to back up, I mentioned that study of golden retrievers and German shepherds. The range was like 22 to 600 something. The mean there, the average, was about 172. But again, and so that, if we think of that as kind of an average vitamin D, and if that even is fair, knowing how much incredible individual variation there is, here's where, again, in this study right here, it was, again, looking back over some retrospective animal studies saying, vitamin D, the plasma concentration of this particular vitamin D metabolite associated with toxicity was always in excess of 375. So again, though, like I just said, there's a variety of reasons where it's not as helpful as you would think. Could it be helpful potentially to confirm exposure? Sure, absolutely. Could it be helpful if you're trying to rule out all sorts of cases of hypercalcemia? Sure. Here's another calcitriol. This one might be a little bit more familiar to many of you. This is the active metabolite of vitamin D. This can also be measured, but interestingly, this is not usually terribly elevated in cases of vitamin D3 poisoning. And again, these tests were only talking about vitamin D3 poisoning. That's it. If you ingest different types of vitamin D analogs, these tests could actually look very different. So with vitamin D3 poisoning, not quite as helpful. So just like I said, not necessarily predictive of when an animal is going to become hypercalcemic. And unfortunately, they don't really help with prognosis. So we're going to skip the poll because of time. All right, treatment. Now we get to how do you treat these guys? The mainstay of treatment, if at all possible, because you know how toxic this stuff can be, is you want to reduce absorption. Pretty simple. So you focus on decontamination. If you can induce vomiting, if it's within a time frame that makes sense to do that, do it. Because vitamin D undergoes enterohepatic recirculation, if you can give them multiple doses of charcoal, do it. Now, you might have questions about when do I induce vomiting, what do I use, etc. For that, because we just didn't have time to talk about it here, I'm going to point you to a decontamination webinar that we did just last year. I'll send that link will also be sent out in the email, the follow-up email that you get. So you can look there and we'll talk in depth about different ways to induce vomiting in cats and dogs, how much charcoal to give, how often to give multi-dose charcoal, etc. So that's where you find that. So again, we want to decontaminate these guys if we can. We want to aim, if we can, to kind of keep our calcium serum levels. So there's your total serum and your ionized calcium. Keep those calcium concentrations below, 12.5, 5.4, depending on which one you're looking at. Again, ionized calcium is going to give you better detail on what's going on with that patient, more accurate detail. So those are the main goals of treatment. Now, how do we treat these guys? Well, the level of aggressiveness, and this is important, that you are going to use to approach that patient really depends on the patient. It depends on how much that patient got and what kind of corresponding signs and clinical signs. What are we seeing clinically and what are we seeing on our lab work? So just because a patient ingested that kind of hypercalcemic dose of 0.5 mg per kg does not necessarily mean all patients are going to become hypercalcemic. So we don't want to throw everything at them right away until we really actually know that we have something to treat. So if you are, though, treating a hypercalcemic, hyperphosphatemic patient, here's what you do. First of all, fluids are the mainstay of therapy. Fluids. Ideally, many of you have heard that if you have a hypercalcemic patient, you want to use normal saline. And yes, that's a reasonable choice. What I would say, though, with respect to what fluids you actually, do want to use, a couple of things. The reason normal saline is touted is because A, it has no calcium, and B, calcium competes with sodium in the kidneys. And so the theory is that you're actually helping encourage calciuresis. So the problem with normal saline is it's a bit of an acidifying fluid. And when you're acidifying bloodstream, what's happening is you can actually kind of create more free or available or ionized calcium and phosphorus. So you could kind of theoretically be contributing to hypercalcemia. So some other fluids that I really like because they have an alkalizing effect are Normar or Plasma-Lyte A. And neither of these, they don't have calcium. They would still be definitely good choices to use. LRS is the one I would avoid the most, simply because it has the lowest sodium content of most of our general fluids, and it also does contain calcium. So these would be the three primary fluid choices. And we're going to want to push fluids potentially pretty hard in these guys, again, depending on what the labs look like, depending on what that patient looks like clinically. And you're going to use your PCV and total solids and body weight to help you guide fluid therapy. If this is a really dry animal, you need to get that animal hydrated, because remember, they might already be a little bit dry because vitamin D in and of itself induces PUPD. So if an animal comes in and they seem clinically hydrated to you, but maybe they've had some vomiting, diarrhea, maybe their PCV total solids are a little bit on the high end of normal, I would go ahead, automatically rehydrate them 5%, right? Because clinically we can't tell if an animal is dehydrated beyond, we can't tell clinically until that patient reaches the level of about 7% dehydration. So it's fine to kind of just assume a general 5% dehydration if that animal's clinical, or again, I said the labs look like it might be a little bit on the dry side. Then the primary, aside from fluids, the primary drug that we're going to reach for are bisphosphonates. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, so bear with me a second. The other ancillary treatments that we use are things like furosemide and corticosteroids. And the idea behind these two types of drugs is that they help increase calciuresis. Furosemide, it helps increase calciuresis by pushing calcium out through the ascending loop of Henle. Pred, let me back up for just a second here. Obviously, the problem with both of these drugs, right, is that they're going to really contribute to dehydration. So ideally, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to reach for Pred or Lasix. We could rely on fluids, we could rely on bisphosphonates to keep the calcium down enough. If that's not cutting it, fluids and bisphosphonates, then yes, we obviously will reach for Pred, we'll reach for Lasix to help reduce serum calcium. So here's some doses here. Your eyes might get a little bit big when you look at that furosemide dose. That's a whopping dose of furosemide. Partly that's borrowed from what was in the literature. Partly it's also borrowed from the fact that we know we need to use a fair bit to actually help allow furosemide to drop your calcium concentrations. But so it's a big dose. You need to make sure your patient is well hydrated before you start. You need to monitor hydration very, very closely if you're using this kind of dose of furosemide. So again, here's where your your PCV and total solids come into play. And weight. Use those things as tools to help you figure out, how much fluid that patient might need. And when in doubt, if you need help, call us, of course. So bisphosphonates. This isn't something that you're familiar with. It's a drug. They're used often in human medicine for women with osteoporosis, for hypercalcemia of malignancy. They're becoming much more common in veterinary medicine too. The bisphosphonate that we prefer in vitamin D3 intoxication is pamidronate. And basically, what we think is happening here is that bisphosphonates will bind to osteoclasts in the bone and prevent the release of calcium from the bone. So obviously the bone is the biggest source of calcium in the body. And with vitamin D, like we talked about, it effectively mobilizes calcium from the bone. So if we can prohibit that, we're going to stop, or we're going to prohibit hypercalcemia, prevent hypercalcemia. So bisphosphonate is certainly something that we reach for when we have reason to believe that hypercalcemia is imminent, or inevitable or occurring. So you can see dosing-wise here, it's something that we give IV. It takes a couple of days to work, so that's part of the problem with it. But when they work really well, and it's something that can be repeated if we need to. Now, I threw calcitonin in here because many of you have heard of it, or maybe you've used it in the past. Calcitonin is not something that we use a lot of in vitamin D cases anymore. It may be, and this one saving grace is that it works really fast, so it could be something that potentially we could use initially in that vitamin D that patient that's wildly hypercalcemic to just help immediately drop serum calcium levels. But the reason we don't like to use it, well, first of all, it's kind of a pain. You have to give it a lot. Second of all, it's kind of hard to find. It's not made as much anymore. Most places don't carry it. And the other thing that happens is animals tend to very quickly become refractory to it. So it doesn't work very long. So it's not a drug that, again, we recommend typically in our vitamin D cases. You will, however, though, often hear us recommend pamidronate. And pamidronate is something that's pretty easy to get from a human pharmacy, human hospital. It's actually pretty cheap, too. All right. So as far as treatment goes, those are kind of your big things. Otherwise, supportive care, I mean, clearly, if you're having GI signs, antiemetics, GI protectants, especially if you have an animal that's on PRED, can be very helpful. Feeding a low calcium diet is helpful. If this were a dog or a cat that were on, let's say, a salmon oil, fish oil supplement, that would be something you would probably want to stop. Those tend to be fairly high in vitamin D. So making sure that dog, again, pet is not getting a lot of calcium in the gut. And then phosphate binders. So clearly, a lot of these animals, like we said, are hyperphosphatemic. So it's very common that we'll use some type of oral phosphate binder, and that's great. You need them, but please be careful because we do tend to see a massive rebound, and suddenly these animals become hypophosphatemic. That's not uncommon at all, so be careful with those. You want to use them, making sure you're monitoring calcium and phosphorus quite regularly when you're using these drugs to make sure, again, these animals are not hypophosphatemic. And the problem here, as we talked about before, vitamin D has a whole body half-life of months, potentially. So if an animal does become hypercalcemic or hyperphosphatemic, you need to have a conversation with your client to say, unfortunately, these are cases that are going to go on for a while. So we need to keep on top of monitoring calcium and phosphorus and see where things are going, making sure it's continuing to stay normal or it's continuing to go down. So initially you might be, once you get that animal out of the hospital, you might be monitoring these patients every 2-3 days or so. But really, we're monitoring them until you're confident that the cat is no longer at risk for hypercalcemia, no longer needs pamidronate because its calcium levels are bumping up every time pamidronate wears off, etc. One thing I didn't put on here, and I apologize, and I meant to, and I'm going to mention it now, is cholestyramine. So cholestyramine you might have heard of with respect to use in vitamin D cases. Cholestyramine is a powder that people might take. It's kind of like a second-line agent to help lower cholesterol. What it does is in the digestive tract, it binds with bile acids. It makes those bile acids insoluble, so they can't be absorbed back into the body. So what would happen, it would bind with a bile acid that's also bound to vitamin D, and therefore that vitamin D cannot be reabsorbed into the body. There's been touted for vitamin D poisoning cases. There's definitely some evidence in humans that it works, or at least there's evidence to say if you're a human, you're taking cholestyramine for whatever reason, medically speaking, maybe it's a cholesterol lowering attempt, and you're also taking your daily dose of vitamin D, you probably will need to take more vitamin D because the cholestyramine is going to bind to some of it. So because there's not a lot of cases of vitamin D poisoning in humans, we don't have as much data to draw off of. There's no data in animals, but it's something that certainly could be helpful. I'll give you the dose here on it. I'll actually add the dose to the slide. So if you do come back and download the slides after today, you'll see the dose. But the dose is anywhere between 0.3 and 1 gram per kg. Typically that's 3 times a day for maybe 2 to 4 days or so. And you base that, is a wide dose range, base the dose on how much vitamin D that patient ingested. Now, if we're talking about 13 mg per kg, I'm going to go on the 1 gram per kg side. If I'm talking about 0.5 mg per kg, I probably wouldn't go nearly as high. So again, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned cholestyramine. All right. To wrap up, a couple of really quick things. One thing that I wanted to mention, because I'm guessing almost everyone here has heard about it, is this thing called the calcium phosphorus solubility index. If that doesn't sound familiar, all we're talking about here is, remember when you were taught, if you multiply your total serum calcium by your total phosphorus, and that number exceeds 60, your patient is at risk for soft tissue mineralization. I was taught that. I'm sure many of us were. Well, so people ask about that all the time. We kind of do still use that as a bit of a rough guide. If you look in the literature, it's really kind of recommended in adults, animals, to keep the product of your calcium and phosphorus below 60. In growing puppies, keep it below 80. But you know what? This is pretty hard to do sometimes. And there's also plenty of cases in which animals, especially puppies, might have a calcium and a phosphorus product that's higher than 8. And that's fine, because that's their normal, that's their baseline. So we really worked hard to try and figure out where this came from. We're not the only ones who are questioning this, and really, is there very good evidence? I did include a reference at the end of the slides from a human physician that wrote an article titled "The Fallacy of the Calcium Phosphorus Product." He's a nephrologist, and so there's some good info there about where this actually came from. And again, use it as a very rough guide. I don't get really, really excited if I have a vitamin D patient and it's an adult dog and that calcium phosphorus product is 65 or even 70. As long as that patient's doing well, we can control clinical signs well. Hopefully that calcium is coming down, etc. That's fine. So don't let this worry you too much. The other thing I wanted to point out, because this is going to happen, is you're going to see a younger animal ingest cholecalciferol product. And age can really make laboratory interpretation difficult. As you know, puppies and kittens have higher normal calcium, total calcium and phosphorus levels than an adult dog. So if you have a patient that comes in and it's a 6-month-old puppy or a 6-month-old kitten, and it looks to you hypercalcemic based on your lab values, your normal values, which are probably for an adult, you need to stop and think about that patient. Is this actually a hypercalcemic patient, or based on the age of this animal, are these normal values? And certainly that's not always easy to do and can require some interpretation and monitoring to see where things are trending to figure out if you really need to treat that animal or not. This handy little table right here, this is just from this article, a JASMA article, where they looked at beagles and Labrador retrievers. Medium breed, large breed, and this is the full range of both the beagles and the labs. So, but again, you can see puppies, 3 to 8 weeks, 8 to 16 weeks. These are animals that have normal calciums that are in the 13s. And if you saw an adult with a total calcium of 13, first of all, you check an ionized calcium to see really what's going on there. But second of all, right, that's probably a patient that you'd be concerned about. So again, age makes a huge difference here. Don't let that fool you when you're looking at these patients. And a couple of tips, but I feel like we've talked about it quite a bit here, is use your ionized calcium again. That's going to be really helpful for you. And use your PCB total solids to help monitor these patients. And again, if you're calling us for help, we'll probably advise that you monitor a PCB total solid every 12 hours. And we'll use that data immensely to help guide fluid rates, to help kind of figure out prognostically where the animal's headed, etc. All right, everyone. So we're wrapping up here. Relay toxicity, I'm not going to go into this. This is relay toxicity, means if an animal, cat or dog, eats another animal that was killed by cholecalciferol, what's the risk of the cat or dog becoming poisoned? And thankfully, cats, extremely rare. Dogs, still quite rare. And I'll let you read the data that's there. All right. So just to wrap up, again, quick reminder to everyone, the reason we're here is because Decon is switching all their rodenticides to cholecalciferol. And they asked us, of course, to help educate the veterinary professionals that are out there, so you do not have a Decon case that you automatically think is an anticoagulant, put it on vitamin K and send it home. That could, in this case, be disastrous. So when in doubt, if you need help, you certainly have places to reach out to, so call us. Again, I want you to just look out for bromethylin because as you saw, there's still a lot of bromethylin out there and I expect that to stay the same. Here's a little wrap up of what cholecalciferol causes. And we're not going to go into this. I'll let you guys read this on your own, but these are just some of the pearls from the lecture. So I deeply apologize that this went over time. I'm very, very grateful to everyone for sticking around. Very quickly as we wrap up, just a reminder, if you need free resources for your clinic, sign up. Email us. We send out newsletters that you can pass along to clients. We have videos that, again, you can put on your social media sites. You can put on your websites. These are videos, little 1-minute videos about certain toxins like chocolate or lilies or xylitol, and they're geared towards educating pet owners. Here are some other goodies that we've put out, and certainly if you need anything, feel free to contact us. Some of these are co-branded with Nationwide, so we might even send you to Nationwide to order some of these. But these I like right here, these little there's no residue stickers. So top 10 dog toxins, top 10 cat toxins. People can put them on their fridge, their window, their laptop. They can peel it off. It doesn't harm the furniture, and much more versatile than magnets. Just a reminder, this is our textbook that I had mentioned earlier, and we'll let you read about that on your own. And if you think toxicology is interesting, you listen to this webinar and you think, hey, this stuff is kind of cool. I would love to learn more about this. I would really like to do this. We are hiring. We actually employ, as I said before, I think over 75 veterinary technicians. So we have a lot of vet techs from 20 different states that work with us. And we are currently looking for 1 to 2 technicians. We don't have any vet openings, but we always welcome resumes of good qualified candidates. You don't have to have a background in toxicology. We do an extensive amount of training. So if you're interested, please check out our careers page. And just to let you know, we do have a couple more webinars coming up. So next month, if you need some more CE, it's me again. We're going to be talking about marijuana. I promise we'll be on time. And then we have a webinar on feline poisonings as well. We actually have one that's not on the list, a wellness webinar on student debt. We partner with AVMA Life to produce some wellness webinars on the topics of wellness. We're looking specifically at veterinary student debt. And I've heard this gentleman speak before. He's actually very good. His wife is a vet. He's in the financial sector. So someone who really understands what we as vets and veterinary professionals are going through when it comes to debt. So watch your email. You should have received a blast for that. If you didn't, email us and tell us you want to get on our distribution list. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. As a reminder, we'll be sending out CE certificates by next Monday. If you don't get it by Monday night, send us an email. There's the email right there. And if you watch this in a group, we only can see, from a registration standpoint, the person who's registered and signed in. So if there's other members out there, you need to email us and let us know the names and email addresses of those who watched it, and you have 24 hours from now. It's a very strict deadline, and in order to receive CE credit for live or interactive CE. So, all right, everyone, thank you so much. As I mentioned, there's a couple of reference slides at the end, articles that I think are good to read, some other vitamin D reference materials I thought that could be helpful. So definitely download a copy of the slides and you can have that. And with that, I'm going to conclude and take a look at the questions. So thank you, everyone, so much for attending. Thank you again to DCON for sponsoring this webinar. Again, I'm very grateful that you saw how important it was to help educate the veterinary community about this change. Very, very grateful for that. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.